Hi, and welcome to Marita's History Corner's third video. Today we will talk about Henry VIII and his life and his time as a monarch. King Henry VIII ruled England for 36 years, presiding over sweeping changes that brought his nation into the Protestant Reformation. He married a series of 6 wives in his search for a political alliance, marital bliss, and a healthy male heir. His desire to annul his first marriage without papal approval led to the creation of a separated Church of England. Of his marriages, 2 ended in annulment, 2 ended in natural deaths, and 2 ended in the beheading of his wives for adultery and treason. His kids, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, would each take turn as England's monarchs. He is also known for the rhyme about his wives, which goes, "Divorced beheaded died, divorced beheaded survived." Henry was born June 28, 1491. He was the second son of Henry VII, which was the first English monarch from the House of Tudor. While his brother Arthur was being prepared for the throne, Henry was being steered towards a church career. With a broad education in theology, music, languages, poetry, and sports. Arthur had been betrothed since age 2 to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Spain's rulers Ferdinand and Isabella, and in November 1501 the teenage couple married. Months later, Arthur died of a sudden illness. Henry became next in line to the throne, and in 1503 he became betrothed to his brother's widow. Henry took the throne at age 17 and became Henry VIII, and he married Catherine of Aragon 6 weeks later. Over the next 15 years, while Henry fought 3 wars with France, Catherine bore him 3 sons and 3 daughters, all but one whom died in infancy. The sole survivor was Mary, known later as Mary I, born in 1516. Henry was an active king in those years, keeping a festive court, hunting, jousting, writing, and playing music. He issued a book-length attack on Martin Luther's church reforms that earned him the title Defender of the Faith from Pope Leo X. However, the lack of a male heir, especially after he fathered an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy in 1519, gnawed at the king. However, in the 1520s, the king became infatuated with a young girl known as Anne Boleyn, who was in his wife's entourage. He was also afraid that God has cursed his marriage to Catherine because of the Old Testament's ban on marrying your brother's widow. The king decided to seek a papal annulment that would free him to remarry again. With the assistance of his powerful advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, he petitioned Pope Clement VII, but was rebuffed due to pressure from Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Wolsey was forced from power for his failure, and he died in 1530 awaiting trial for treason. With the backing of the English Parliament and clergy, Henry decided that he didn't need the Pope's permission to decide on issues affecting the Church of England. In 1533, Henry and Anne were married, and their daughter Elizabeth was born. Mary was declared illegitimate, and Elizabeth was named as heir. England's monasteries were closed and often sold off to add to Henry's wealth. In January of 1536, Henry was unhorsed and injured during a jousting tournament. When news of his injury reached the pregnant Anne, she miscarried, giving birth to a stillborn son. Henry then spurned her and turned his affection to another woman at his court, Jane Seymour. Within 6 months, he had executed Anne for treason and incest, and married Jane, who quickly gave him the son later known as Edward VI, but she died 2 weeks later. Henry's fourth marriage bore similarities to his first. Anne of Cleves were a political bride, chosen to cement an alliance with her brother, the ruler of a Protestant duchy in Germany. The marriage only lasted for a few days before Henry had it annulled. Then he married Catherine Howard, but 2 years later she too was beheaded for adultery and treason. In the last years of his reign, Henry grew moody, obese, and suspicious, hobbled by personal intrigue and the persistence of his leg wound from his jousting injury. His final marriage to the widow Catherine Parr in 1543 saw his reconciliation with Mary and Elizabeth, who were restored to the line of succession. Henry VIII died 55 years old on January 28, 1547. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, succeeded him to the throne, but died only 6 years later at age 15. Mary I spent her 5-year reign steering England back to the Catholic fold. But Elizabeth I, the longest reigning of the Tudor monarchs, with her 44 years on the throne, re-entranced her father's religious reforms. Well, that was all for this video. The next video will be out May 5th. It will be about Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, the first two wives of Henry VIII. So remember to subscribe and keep watching the videos. Hi and welcome to Marita's History Corner's 4th video. Today I will talk about Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Catherine was born in Alcalá de Henares in Spain on the night on December 15th to 16 in 1485. She was the fifth and youngest child of the Catholic kings Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. A key component of the sovereigns' strategies was the marital alliances that they made for their children. Catherine, as the fourth daughter, was of less political importance, and therefore her betrothal in 1489 to the son of Henry VII was in the nature of a gamble. Henry had only established himself as King of England from the Wars of the Roses in the year of Catherine's birth. And in 1489 it was still possible that the fledgling Tudor dynasty might be overthrown. Nevertheless, in a treaty of Medina del Campo in 1489, it was agreed that Catherine would marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, and travel to England when she was 14. Over the next 10 years, further negotiation took place, and the young couple were married by proxy. The Spanish princess left Spain in autumn 1501 and arrived at Plymouth on October 8th. Travelling slowly towards London, the party was met at Dogmersfield in Hampshire by Henry VII and Prince Arthur, who had been summoned from Ludlow, where he was presiding over the Council of Wales. Arthur turned 15 on September 20th. The couple, unable to converse in other than Latin, were briefly introduced before etiquette demanded that the bride would be kept away from the groom until the wedding day. Catherine was lodged in Lambeth Palace in London until the wedding was celebrated in St. Paul's Cathedral on December 14th. She was led to the altar by her groom's 10-year-old brother, Henry, the Duke of York. The marriage of the young couple were extremely popular in both court and country. The festivities to mark the occasion were lavish and continued jousting, feasting, and dancing. Arthur himself had either little taste or little energy for dancing, performing only once, whilst Henry, the Duke of York, showed himself as a boisterous performer. The young couple were put into bed in public, well aware that their primary duty was to produce sons to inherit the English throne. Not long after the marriage, it was decided that Arthur would return to his duties in the marches of Wales, and there was some debate as to whether Catherine should accompany him. It was not uncommon for a young couple to consummate marriage and then be separated, as too much sexual activity at a young age was believed injurious to the health. Eventually, it was decided that Catherine would go. By March, Arthur was seriously ill, and he died on April 2nd, 1502. Catherine returned to London, and the debate started as for her future. Initially, Queen Isabella wanted her daughter to return home, but Henry VII was reluctant to see the vast jointure that Catherine would have been entitled to, of 1/3 of the revenues of the Principality of Wales and the Duchy of Cornwall sailing away, particularly since he had not yet received the whole of Catherine's dowry. A marriage was mooted for Catherine with the young Duke of York, some 5.5 years younger than she was. For such a marriage, a papal dispensation was needed, the type depending on whether or not the first marriage was consummated. Initially, there was doubt as to the status of Catherine's virginity, as Catherine's confessor and principal lady, Donna Elvira Manuel, have conflicting accounts. The Spanish sovereigns believed Donna Elvira and wrote clearly that although Catherine was a virgin, they would request a dispensation covering the case of consummation, because they feared that at a later date the English king might wiggle out of the bargain. The initial dispensation gave consent for Catherine and Henry to marry, on the assumption that she had consummated her marriage to his brother, whilst an accompanying papal brief that appears only to have been dispatched to Spain, enlarged on this with the insertion of the words "perhaps consummated." Despite the agreement, Henry VII dragged his feet, and Ferdinand and he continued to quarrel over Catherine's dowry. In 1504, Queen Isabella died, and the crowns of Spain broke apart as her daughter Juana, Duchess of Burgundy, inherited. Catherine's position became increasingly difficult when she did not have sufficient funds to maintain her household, without encroaching on plate and jewels that Henry VII claimed were part of her dowry. And she lived a miserable existence, sending increasingly emotional letters to her father requesting help, which Ferdinand largely ignored. The marriage between Catherine and Henry should have happened in 1505, when Henry was 14, the age of consent for a boy. The prince made a formal retraction of his betrothal, since it had been made during his minority. Nevertheless, negotiations for a marriage continued to take place. The Gordian knot was finally cut in 1509 when Henry VII died. Within few weeks of becoming king, the young Henry had married Catherine, and they were crowned together on June 24th, 1509. Over the next few years, Henry and Catherine appeared to live an almost idyllic life, as a happy young couple in the first flush of love and power. They danced and hunted vigorously, patronized musicians and scholars. The couple was also close politically, as Henry, seeking to establish himself as a new King Henry, allied with Ferdinand of Aragon to invade France. Before Henry led his army in France, he appointed Catherine as regent, a role she carried out extremely effectively, including working with the Earl of Surrey to repel the invasion of James IV of Scotland, who, as the ally of France, had invaded northern England. James was defeated at Flodden, in one of England's most comprehensive victories against its northern neighbour, and Catherine identified herself closely with it. Unfortunately, matters did not go quite as well in France. Although Henry won territory, the first territory won by the English in France since 1453. It had little strategic value, and he was routinely let down by Ferdinand. Ferdinand's behavior undoubtedly weakened Catherine's political influence, which gradually began to be replaced by one of Henry's ministers, Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal and Archbishop of York. Wolsey was by nature against war. It was costly and wasteful. He looked for peace and political alliances, including with the French, whom Catherine had been brought up to see as the enemy. Catherine resented his influence, both personally and politically. Another problem was creeping into the royal marriage, the lack of children. Catherine became pregnant within weeks of her marriage, but miscarried a daughter in 1510. A son was born on January 1st, 1511, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, but he died within months. There were probably one or two more miscarriages before Catherine gave birth to the one child who would survive until adulthood, Mary, born February 18th, 1516. A final pregnancy in 1518 ended in a stillborn daughter. By 1525, Henry concluded there would be no more children. Although barely 40, Catherine seemed to have reached menopause and had not conceived in 70 years. For Henry, only second in his dynasty, to have a son was his paramount duty. Despite the example of a few women who had very successful regencies, the idea of a woman sovereign was unacceptable to the king. He had an illegitimate son in 1519 and inferred that he was capable of having healthy sons. And there must be another problem afflicting his marriage to Catherine. One event occurred that created the perfect storm for Catherine's marriage. Henry had fallen violently in love with one of Catherine's maid of honor, Anne Boleyn. Henry now sought to be released from the marriage to Catherine. It would be unfair to Henry to suggest that his concern about breaking God's law about marrying his brother's wife was completely cynical, only trumped up to rid himself of an unwanted spouse. He was a genuinely religious man, and is likely to have sought understanding in the Bible for his problems. Nevertheless, the spur of love affair undoubtedly drove him on. Although we should not assume that he intended to marry Anne immediately. It was certainly not usual for popes to grant powerful kings ways out of undesirable marriages. And had circumstances in Europe been different, Clement VII might have looked favorable upon Henry's request. Unfortunately for Henry, the rising tide of Lutheranism challenging papal authority made the Pope less likely to rule that his predecessor had acted outside his power by granting the dispensation. This reluctance is compounded by the fact that Rome had been comprehensively sacked in 1527 by the troops of the Emperor Charles, who now dominated Italy. Charles was disinclined to see his aunt cast off and his cousin Mary disinherited. He may have declined to marry the child, but that did not mean that a cousin who was likely to be Queen of England was not a useful branch in his family tree. Clement agreed to a trial of the marriage in England, presided over by Cardinal Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio. The trial took place in Blackfriars in 1529, and Catherine's speech to Henry against all legal etiquette is one of the most famous in Tudor history. In it, she declared that her marriage was valid as her last marriage had not been consummated. She firmly denied that the loss of many children that she and Henry had been her fault. She repeated her faithful and loving service as his wife and finally declared that she would not accept any jurisdiction except the Pope himself. She then sailed majestically out of the court, refusing orders to return. No doubt, this king was uneasily aware of the cheer with which their beloved queen was greeted by the waiting crowds. Catherine and Henry's marriage limped along in public for another 2 years, in which time she continued to be treated as queen. Eventually, in 1531, she was banished from court and forbidden to see either Henry or their daughter again. Over the next 2 years, Henry was determined to take matters into his own hands, and in January 1533 he married Anne Boleyn. In 1533, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, convened another court at Dunstable, at which he declared that Catherine's marriage had been invalid from the beginning. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy and Succession made it a criminal offence to refer to Catherine as queen. She was demoted to her previous rank, Princess Dowager of Wales. She continued to write to the Pope requesting him to confirm her marriage, and she refused to communicate in any way with anyone who did not address her as queen. She was moved further away from London, eventually to Kimbolton Castle, under the guardianship of Sir Edmund Bedingfield. In January 1536, when it became apparent that she was dying, Henry permitted a last visit from Eustace Chapois, the Emperor's ambassador. Whether this was an act of compassion or to show the Emperor that his aunt was not being ill-treated has been conjectured. He certainly would not permit their daughter Mary to visit her mother. After Chapois' departure, Maria de Dalinas, Lady Willoughby, that had come with Catherine to England 36 years before, lied her way in to see her former mistress, who died on January 7, 1536. Catherine was buried honorably in Peterborough Abbey, although her funeral was suitable for a Dowager Princess of Wales and not a queen. Catherine's monument, renewed in the 19th century, is still honored, and the arms of England and Spain were rehung in the 20th century on the order of Queen Mary of Teck, wife of King George V. And now it's over to Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was born at some point during the first few years of the 16th century. Dates of 1501, 1503 and 1507 have been conjectured, though the earlier dates are more likely. She was probably born in Norfolk and baptized in the impressive church of Sal that her ancestor had patronized. Anne's parents were Sir Thomas Boleyn of Blicklingholt, Norfolk, and his wife, Lady Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the Earl of Surrey. Sir Thomas was noted for his mastery in French, a useful accomplishment, but it was also used as the language of European diplomacy. Armed with this skill, Sir Thomas undertook a number of embassies abroad, and was on good terms with Archduchess Marguerite of Austria, regent of the Low Countries. This friendship enabled him to put his daughter Anne in Marguerite's court in Michelin in 1512. Marguerite writes kindly about Anne's progress and describes her as so presentable and so pleasant, considering her youthful age, that I am more beholden to you for sending her to me than you to me. At some point, Anne transferred to the household of the Queen of France, Mary, Henry VIII's sister, and then her immediate successor, Claude de Valois. The French court under François I was the center of Renaissance learning and culture, and Anne thrived in this atmosphere. In 1521, Anne may have been reunited with her family, if only briefly, the Field of Cloth of Gold, if she attended as one of Queen Claude's train. In 1522, Anne returned to England and was found a place as maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Anne's first recorded appearance was in March 1522 at a banquet held at York Place, the home of Henry VIII's minister, Cardinal Wolsey. The entertainment was for the benefit of the French ambassador, and Anne played the role of Perseverance amongst other ladies named after virtues, such as Beauty, played by Mary, the French queen, and Kindness, played by Anne's sister Mary. Anne was destined for a grand match. Her paternal grandmother, Margaret Butler, was a contender for the title of Lance of the Butler Earl of Ormond, and it was agreed with the king's support that Anne should marry James Butler, the son of the other contender, to settle the matter. For unknown reasons, the match never took place. Anne had a far more attractive match in mind. Lord Henry Percy, the son and heir of the Earl of Northumberland, and a member of the household of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, was her suitor. This would have been a splendid match for Anne, and it appears that the young couple was genuinely in love. The match was brutally broken off by the Cardinal and the Earl. At some point during 1525, Henry VIII fell victim to Anne's charm. She was not considered particularly beautiful according to the prevalent tastes, but had a sex appeal that drew male admiration. Initially, Henry hoped to make her his mistress, although he was starting to wonder about the validity to his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. It would do him a disservice to say that his attraction to Anne was his only motivating factor in his quest for an annulment. Anne, however, rejected Henry's overtures. It is possible that Anne, genuinely religious, rejected Henry for pure motives, and agreed to pursue the relationship only when he persuaded her that his first marriage was not valid. There can be no doubt that Henry had come to believe that his marriage to Catherine was flawed. Whatever her motivation, Anne refused to become his mistress, despite the outpouring of love that can still be read in the extant 17 love letters he sent her. The next 7 years were spent in increasing frustration, as Henry sought an annulment from Pope Clement VII, whose hands were tied by the fact that the emperor, who effectively controlled Rome, was Catherine's nephew. During these years, Anne was constantly by the king's side. If, as had been said, she made it her ambition to destroy Wolsey for breaking the match with Percy, then she succeeded. Wolsey was dismissed from his temporal offices and banished to his archdiocese of York. Anne was an evangelical, eager to see the Bible translated into English, and to see the flagrant abuses of the clergy remedied. Anne is credited to have shown Henry the book on the obedience of a Christian man, by the exiled heretic William Tyndale. In the book, Tyndale claims that God put the king on the top of the hierarchy and not the pope, and that subjects should be obedient in all things to the king. Unsurprisingly, Henry was thrilled by this. "This is a book for me and all the kings to read," he apparently said. Nevertheless, it was 4 more years until Henry broke with Rome and married Anne. Prior to the wedding, he raised her to nobility by giving her the title Lady Marquis of Pembroke. Armed with her new title, Anne and Henry went to Calais in October 1532 to meet the French king. Humiliatingly, Queen Eleanor and the Queen of Navarre refused to meet Anne. Francois, however, met her and danced with her. It is probably in Calais that Henry and Anne first slept together. By the new year, Anne was pregnant and the couple secretly married, probably on January 25, 1533. The new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, presided over an ecclesiastical court in May of that year, and confirmed that the king's first marriage was null and the union with Anne was valid. She was prayed for as queen at Easter 1533, and June 1st she was crowned. At September 7th, 1533, Anne's first child was born, and to a huge disappointment for both parents, it was a girl, named Elizabeth. A boy would have vindicated Henry's annulment and his break with Rome. But to have turned the country upside down for another girl was a huge blow. Nevertheless, the couple put a brave face on the outcome and hoped a boy would follow. Although, in 1534, most of the nobles surrounding Henry and Anne were reconciled to an outward obedience. Anne's temperament, that had made her an ideal mistress, did not endear her to Henry as a wife, or to his friends and family as a suitable queen. Anne, with her temper, pride, and wit, was not fitting easily into the mold. Anne had laid down strict regulation for the seemingly conduct of her ladies. Her religious zeal for the reform of the church and support for evangelical thoughts were sincere, and her sharp intellect was matched with a sharp and often spiteful tongue, which alienated many and even irritated her former supporter, her uncle, the rather self-serving Duke of Norfolk. She should have taken more care to keep Norfolk sweet. She seemed to have failed to understand that even Queen needs friends, and she would have benefited from some support to counterbalance the barely concealed contempt of the older ladies at court. Even her aunt, Norfolk's wives, refused to serve her, protesting her support for Catherine. The miscarriage in 1534 did not help the situation, and it was rumored that Henry had a new mistress. Nevertheless, after 8 years of being the woman Henry looked at, the appearance of a mistress must have been distressing for Queen Anne. 1535 was a difficult year. The executions of Sir Thomas More and Bishop Fisher shocked Europe, and Henry's daughter Mary continued to be defiant. The king and queen made an extended summer progress, included a trip to the delightful Sudley Castle. Perhaps being in holiday mood relaxed them, for by autumn Anne was pregnant again. In order to preserve her health, she remained in London while Henry and much of the court went on a hunting trip in September, during which he either renewed or started his acquaintanceship with Jane, daughter of Sir John Seymour of Woolfall, Wiltshire. Jane was brought to court as one of Anne's maids of honor. During the winter of 1535 and 1536, Henry paid her attention that deeply grieved his wife, and made the gender of her unborn child even more important. In January 1536, Anne miscarried. On April 24th, 1536, Henry signed a commission, headed by Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, for investigation into some unspecified wrongdoing. Shortly after, 5 men, Mark Smeaton, a musician, Sir Henry Norris, groom of the stool and one of the king's closest friends, Sir William Brereton, Sir Francis Weston, and, appallingly, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne's brother, were all arrested. They were accused of adultery with the Queen and conspiring against the king. Smeaton confessed to adultery, perhaps with the aid of torture. The others protested their innocence strongly, but to no use. Anne herself was arrested May 2nd, and the commission read her charges before she was conveyed to the Tower of London. Whilst there, she was housed comfortably and surrounded by women such I have never loved, who reported every frightened, hysterical word she uttered. Anne's co-accused, except George Boleyn, were tried before her and found guilty, which of course meant that a guilty verdict against her was inevitable. It was inevitable from the start. Henry was determined to be rid of her. At the time, even Anne's enemies, at home and abroad, entertained doubts about her guilt. An opinion is divided on whether Henry really thought her guilty. If he did, he was acting very different from what he did later when another wife was accused in a similar fashion. During Anne's imprisonment, he feasted and danced with Jane Seymour and seemed to not have a care in the world. Finally, on May 15, Anne, Queen of England, was tried in the Tower of London. And despite a very eloquent defense, she was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning or beheading. Her brother, too, was convicted. A swordsman from Saint Omer in France had already been sent for, in the anticipation of the verdict of Anne. And on May 19th, she was executed, having sworn her innocence before taking the sacrament. Her remains are buried within the church of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower precinct. Well, that was all for this time. I really hope you enjoyed the video, so remember to subscribe. The next video will be out May 19th, and it will be about Anne of Cleves and Jane Seymour. Hi, and welcome to Marita's History Corner's 5th video. Today we're going to talk about Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves. Jane was one of 3 surviving daughters of Sir John and Marjorie, Lady Seymour. Her birth date was not recorded, but was probably between 1507 and 1508. The Seymours, although of ancient lineage, were not important in national affairs, concentrating on solid service to the crown in their home county of Wiltshire, where Sir John, as well as serving as sheriff, were the hereditary warden of Severnake Forest. Jane's mother was a descendant from Edward III, half-cousin to Elizabeth Tilney, Countess of Surrey, and a noted beauty in the court of Henry VII. Like the rest of her siblings, Jane was probably born at the family home at Woolfall, Wiltshire. Nothing definite is known about Jane's education. She could read and write and probably spoke some French, still widely used among the upper class, but she appears not to have received the modern humanist education that her predecessors as Henry's wives did. What Jane would have learned were skills as a gentlewoman, who would expect to marry someone of her own class and run a country estate, supervising a large household of indoor staff and senior estate workers, such as stewards and bailiff. This type of education included accounting, some law, fine cookery, management of dairy, needlework of all kinds, the use of herbs for medicinal purposes, and the tenets of her religion. Hunting and hawking, dancing and playing musical instruments were also featured. When Jane was about 7, her eldest surviving brother Edward started his career at court. First with a position in the household of Princess Mary, daughter of Henry VII, who was married in 1415 to Louis XII of France. Edward went in her retinue to France and remained there until the widow Mary's return the following year. Jane passed the usual age for marriage for a gentlewoman, of late teens to early 20s. There is no evidence of any match being sought. This is surprising, as even if Jane herself were not a great beauty, personal attraction was hardly a basis for marriage. It was an economical or political matter arranged by the couple's parents or guardians. Perhaps Jane didn't have a sufficient dowry to attract an eligible match. Jane's mother, not a regular lady-in-waiting, attended the Queen on important state occasions, and may have introduced her daughter to Catherine's notice. Similarly, other relatives may have requested a place for her. In particular, Sir Francis Bryan, her half-second cousin. Sir Francis certainly supported Jane's career later. Although there is no proof that Jane served Catherine, her attitude to Catherine and her daughter Mary later suggested that she did indeed have a position with the Queen in the late 1520s, when Henry had already sought an annulment and Jane's fellow maid of honor, Anne Boleyn, was the focus of the king's passion. Anne was also a second cousin of Jane's. In 1531, Catherine was exiled. It is unknown whether Jane accompanied her mistress to the moor, the house in Hertfordshire to which she was sent. On January 1st, 1534, Henry VIII gave his customary New Year's presents. One of the recipients was Mistress Seymour. In 1534, Sir Robert Dormer was approached by Sir Francis Bryan to suggest a match between Sir Robert's son William and Jane. According to the record, Sir John's wife rejected the idea out of hand and quickly arranged for William to marry elsewhere. We cannot say with certainty anything at all about Jane from her birth until September 1535, when she definitely was in the retinue of Anne Boleyn. During that month, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn visited Wolf Hall as part of their summer progress. Whilst it is possible that Henry had first noticed Jane in early 1535, it is in the autumn of that year that the first is evidence that he was pursuing her. The court returned to London, and Henry's attention to Jane became so marked that many observers, including the imperial ambassador Chapoy, thought that Jane might eclipse Anne in the king's favour. As Anne fell pregnant that autumn and Catherine was still alive, there was no thought of Jane replacing Anne as queen. However, the role of king's mistress was now vacant. Jane, whether from natural inclination, ambition, or family instruction, coyly declined Henry's advances. Just as rejection had increased Henry's passion for Anne Boleyn, so it enhanced his interest for Jane. The court was watching, as Jane was believed to be a firm supporter of Catherine and Princess Mary, and was thus a natural focus of Anne Boleyn's legion of enemies. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died, and Anne's position, far from being strengthened, was now weaker. Whilst Catherine lived, Henry couldn't feasibly reject his second wife. But if Anne did not keep what Henry perceived to be her part of the bargain and deliver a son, he would take steps to get rid of her. On January 29th that year, Anne miscarried, and in her grief alleged that part of the miscarriage was due to the shock of seeing Jane sitting in Henry's lap. Her enemies immediately scented blood, and saw the promotion of Jane as an excellent means to unseating her. Towards the end of March, Henry sent Jane a present of money, by no means unusual for the Tudor court. Jane threw herself to her knees, took the king's letter, kissed the seal, and returned it to the messenger, begging him to tell the king that she was a virtuous woman, and that she could only receive a present of money on her marriage to an honourable gentleman. Henry, always conservative about his ideas about how virtuous women should behave, was thrilled about this response. He decided he would only see Jane if she was chaperoned by her family, and arranged with Cromwell that the minister should change apartment with Edward Seymour, so that the king could visit her regularly by the means of a private corridor. Over the spring of 1536, Jane drew support from a wide array of people as a potential queen. Descriptions of Jane does not give an especially favorable opinion of her appearance. She was fashionably fair-haired, but very pale, without the blushing cheeks that were admired. Whilst Chapoy did not think she was witty, He thought she probably had a good understanding. Henry might well have been tired of wit after 10 years of Anne's witty tongue, and Catherine's ability to drive a point home. Jane was referred to as gentle and kind in private letters, and she was certainly willing to use her influence over Henry to promote the cause of Princess Mary, even to the extent of Henry rebuking her for not concentrating on her own offspring. By April, plans were afoot for Anne's downfall. The Tudor legal system was not based on the notion of innocent until proven guilty. Instead, there was the general presumption that if a person were tried, he were likely to be guilty, or the king's officers would not have pursued the case. Jane's state of mind in May 1536 is of course a matter of conjecture. Having been part of Anne's household, she must have been aware that the charges was most likely false. Yet she may have thought Anne deserved death for her treatment of Catherine, and for the religious changes she had enabled, which James seemed to dislike. She is highly likely to have wanted to be queen, and she may even have felt genuine affection for Henry. He had enormous charm, and Jane would not have been the first woman to think that her lover's wife did not understand him. Regardless of her feelings, Jane had no control over the trial and execution of Anne. The day after, she and Henry were formally betrothed, and on May 29th, the couple were married. Jane made her first formal appearance as queen on June 2nd, and her household were sworn in that day. 2 days later, she was proclaimed queen at Greenwich and dined under the cloth of estate. Throughout the summer, Henry and Jane behaved as a honeymoon couple, with feasts and festivals. On June 15th, she rode beside Henry to Westminster Abbey, as part of the ceremonial surroundings the opening of the Parliament. Her train was carried by the King's own niece, Lady Margaret Douglas. She also received the customary visits from ambassadors, including the Imperial Ambassador Chapoy. During the early months of her tenure, Jane tried to persuade Henry to reconcile with his eldest daughter, Princess Mary. Her pleas were not sufficient to allow Mary back into favor, without the princess first accepting that her parents' marriage was invalid. Once Mary had swallowed this bitter pill, she was welcomed back to her father's favor, and Jane and her new stepdaughter were soon on excellent terms. In 1536, a new Act of Succession were passed, naming Jane's children as his heirs. Whilst Jane was gratified by this, it also underlined her prime function, to bear a son. During the autumn of 1536, the rebellion known as the Pilgrimage of Grace broke out. Jane tried to intervene for at least one convent, and during her pregnancy, which began around the time of the rebellion, and its offshoots were finally squashed, Henry funded 2 monastic houses to pray for her. The coronation of Jane has first been planned for July, but then October 1537. The first postponement was probably due to plague in London, and the second because of the rebellion. Nevertheless, Jane received an excellent jointure as queen, and there was much rivalry for places in her household. She was always determined to be queen, more in the mold of Catherine than Anne, with more restraint and aloof manners towards her courtiers. In spring 1537, Jane finally fell pregnant. Her pregnancy progressed normally, although she expressed a strong craving for quail, rapidly supplied by Lady Lisle, who was keen to carry favor to place her own daughter in Jane's entourage. As the news of the impending birth spread around the country, there was widespread rejoicing with bonfires and Thanksgiving services. On September 16th, Jane entered her period of confinement at Hampton Court. She went into labor less than a month later on October 9th. Following a smooth pregnancy, the labor was problematic. For 3 agonizing days she struggled, before delivering a longed-for son on October 12th. Henry and everyone up and down the country was jubilant. In accordance to customs, Jane remained in bed, signing letters announcing the birth to foreign courts. On October 15th, she was wrapped in furs and carried to a daybed to receive her courtiers after the christening. Shortly after, she began a fever and 2 days later received last rites. After a brief rally, she again deteriorated. Prayers were ineffectual and Jane died on October 24th, 1537. She was buried the following month with all the ceremony that Henry's court was capable of, at St. Paul's Chapel, Windsor. Henry mourned her sincerely and always referred to her as his most loved wife. She was painted beside him even after her death in a family portrait he commissioned in 1545. He also chose to be buried beside her. And that was all for Jane Seymour, and now we're going to talk about Anne of Cleves. Anne was the daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, and Maria, the heiress to the Duchy of Jülich-Burg. Both duchies were fiefdoms of the Holy Roman Empire. Anne was born in Düsseldorf Castle and the second of her parents' children to survive. She was given a very traditional education, supervised by her mother. She spoke only her native High Dutch and, whilst she was well versed in traditional skills of household management and needlework, she did not learn any of the courtly skills that was prevalent in the larger courts of Europe. During Anne's early childhood, a religious upheaval instigated by the Augustinian monk Martin Luther happened. In Cleves, Anne's father did not join the Lutheran party overtly, and Anne was brought up as a Catholic. During the early 1530s, Henry VIII of England considered entering into an alliance with the German princess to gain support for the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But despite urging from his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, he did not go further than discussion. The king preferred to maintain an alliance with Francois I of France against Charles V. Henry was firmly opposed to Luther and his followers, and Luther was equally unimpressed by Henry. By the late 1530s, the situation had changed. Francois I and Charles V had formed a defensive alliance, and Henry's council urged him to take a bride from Cleves. Henry himself was far more demanding in the matter of wives than most royal husbands. He had consciously chosen his previous wives, and he wanted a wife to love. Anne and her sister Amelia had in 1538 been mentioned as possible wives for Henry VIII. But it was mentioned that neither were considered particularly attractive or learned. But with few other avenues in 1539, emissaries were sent to Cleves. Negotiations were opened for Anne to marry Henry in 1538, much to the irritation of Charles V. Anne's father died in early 1539, and Anne's brother were left in charge of his sister's destiny. He was eager to promote the match, and envoys from England were sent to report on the suitability of Anne and her sister Amelia for a possible bride for King Henry. In August 1539, Hans Holbein, Henry's court painter, was dispatched to Cleves to paint Anne and Amelia. Before the matter could proceed to a conclusion, it had to be established that Anne was free to marry. There had perhaps been an earlier betrothal to the infant son of Duke of Lorraine. The Cleves' government reassured the English envoys that the discussion had not led to a binding betrothal. On October 4th, 1539, the marriage treaty was signed. As the season was now unfavorable for a sea journey, a safe conduct was requested from Mary of Hungary to allow Anne to travel overland to Calais. The permission was granted. Anne said goodbye to her family and set out for a foreign land and an unknown husband. On her arrival at Antwerp, she was greeted with enthusiasm by the English merchants of the city, who gave her a torchlit procession. As she entered English territory at Calais, guns were fired in salute. Because of the weather and unpredictable sea conditions, Anne remained in Calais for 2 more weeks. Anne passed time in learning to play English card games, to speak some of the language of her new home. Presumably, she had never seen a ship or the sea before. All in all, Anne made an excellent impression. Whilst gracious, she was not over familiar, and showed every sign of wanting to fit in with the English customs, even going as far as to ask about table manners. Anne's flotilla of 50 ships finally set sail 2 days after Christmas, arriving at Deal at 5 p.m. on December 27th, to be met by Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and his wife, Catherine Willoughby. The sea journey had been terrible, and Anne was very seasick, but she had no time to rest, moving on to Dover Castle, then Barham Downs, before arriving at the Bishop's Palace in Rochester on December 21st. Henry was now so impatient to meet his new bride that he decided to make an unannounced visit. It was a common courting trick for the groom to arrive incognito, and the lady, who was supposed to recognize him, was to pretend to be overcome by his charm. Unfortunately, Anne was either completely unaware of this courtly game, or genuinely had no idea it was Henry that had bursted into her apartments at Rochester and tried to embrace her. She received the intruder coldly and continued to watch the bull baiting that was being carried on outside the window of our room. Henry was brought face to face with the fact that without his royal persona, a young lady would have no interest in him. He exited the room quickly and returned covered in purple velvet. The oohs and ahs of the assembled company. Anne, now realizing the magnitude of her error, humbled herself lowly. The betrothed couple conversed, probably through an interpreter, for a polite length of time before Henry departed. He immediately told Cromwell that he was deeply disappointed, alike her not. It was immediately apparent that Henry found Anne deeply physically unappealing. Henry's first thought was to try to find a way out. Could Cromwell come up with a reason to stop the marriage? But such a move would be an insult of the most outrageous proportions. To reject the Duke of Cleves' sister like an unwanted parcel might drive Cleves back into the arms of the Emperor. The pre-contract with Lorraine was aired, but the Cleves delegation insisted that it had not been binding, and they would produce documentary evidence to prove what they were saying was true within 3 months. Cromwell and his other councillors informed the king that he had to go through with it. Preparations proceeded. Anne made a formal entrance into her new capital city, with a reception at Blackheath, where she was greeted by the court and her new family. Her 3 stepchildren, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, Henry's niece, Lady Margaret Douglas, daughter-in-law, Mary, Duchess of Richmond. It was a grand affair, and Anne was widely cheered. Whatever Henry thought, Most people that met Anne seemed to like her. On January 5th, Anne confirmed that she was free to marry, and Henry, despite murmuring that he was not well handled, had perforce to continue. They were married the following day in the Queen's closet at Hampton Court. After the usual festivities, the couple retired to bed. The following morning, when Cromwell asked his master how he had enjoyed his wedding night, the king replied he had not liked Anne before and liked her even less now. He later maintained that having a good feel of the merchandise, he could not be provoked or steered to know her carnally. Since the main purpose of this marriage, as far as Henry was concerned, was to increase his family, his inability to consummate posed a huge problem. He continued to make efforts to overcome his distaste for a few weeks, but his doctor told him to not overstrain himself. Consequently, he would go into bed, hold Anne's hand as he kissed her and bade her good night, and in the morning kiss her again before he was departing. Anne's ladies soon became aware that all was not well, and asked her about what was going on behind the bed curtains, as they were worried that there were no signs of a pregnancy. Anne, either genuinely unaware of the facts of life, or feigning ignorance for her own reasons, told the ladies about Henry kissing her and asked if that was not enough. There must be more than that, Lady Rutland told her, before a Duke of York could materialize. But Anne was probably perfectly satisfied with being a queen without having to endure the intimate attention of her less than ideal husband. There was no question but that she should receive a full household, and the jointure appropriate to her station. Amongst the Queen's new maids of honor was the attractive niece of the Duke of Norfolk, Catherine Howard. It was not long until the king noticed this vivacious girl, and since the political landscape of Europe had changed, leaving an alliance with Cleves as less valuable than before, looked for a way to rid himself of Anne. Anne was not to be bundled off to the Tower on trumped-up charges. She was a foreign princess, and even if Henry didn't find her attractive, he had no personal animosity against her. Instead, two arguments were put forward on which an annulment could be based. The first was a pre-contract with Francois of Lorraine. The second was the king's inability to consummate the marriage, which conveniently proved to be caused by his inner knowledge that the marriage to a woman pre-contracted elsewhere was invalid. On June 26th, Anne was directed to move to Richmond Palace away from the rest of the court, on the pretext that it was plague in the air. She probably had no inkling that the next day she would receive a delegation from the council with astonishing news, and Anne's response was that she would accept whatever Henry thought was right. She wrote a letter to Henry accepting that their marriage was invalid and returned her wedding ring. She signed herself Anna, the daughter of Cleves. Henry was in many ways a generous man, and he was now open-handed about his treatment of Anne. She was to rank immediately after any new queen, and his current and any future daughters. She was also granted estates to the value of £3,000 per year, not a great deal less than the Queen's jointure, and the same annual amount that Henry would settle on his daughters in his will. The one stipulation was that Anne would remain in England. She was well treated and honored, but she was a hostage for her brother's consent. Thus, Henry had all the benefits of a marriage with Cleves, without having to live with a woman he found unattractive. One of the first acts of obedience required by the former queen was for her to share the humiliating story of her rejection with her brother, and initially suggested that she would prefer someone else to break the news. But the Duke of Suffolk persuaded her, no doubt with copious hints of what would happen to disobedient subjects, to write to Wilhelm. The letter emphasized how happy she was obeying God's will, and whilst she could not have Henry as a husband, his merit as a brother was extolled. She hoped that Wilhelm would continue the alliance. Once the annulment was completed and Henry had married Catherine, Henry and Anne seemed to get on well. He was invited to court from time to time and treated Catherine with all the respect due to a queen. And Henry visited her. She had received Hever Castle, Richmond Palace, and Bletchingley Manor, amongst other properties, as a part of the financial settlement. After Henry's death, Anne became increasingly concerned about money. Her settlement had been extremely generous, and she wrote several letters both to the council and to her home about the cost of everything. In 1553, when Mary became queen, Anne travelled in the first carriage behind the new sovereign to her coronation, seated beside Elizabeth. She wrote a number of letters home suggesting that she wanted to return to Cleves, but there was no prospect of that. She remained on good terms with Mary, visiting court from time to time. In early 1557, whilst living in Chelsea, she fell ill and died in July of that year. Her will made generous bequests to charities and nominated gifts for friends and family. The funeral was carried out with royal pomp, paid for by Queen Mary, and was laid to rest in Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey. Well, that was all for this time. The next video will be out June 2nd and will be about the last two queens of Henry VIII. Hi, and welcome to Marita's History Corner's 6th video. Today we'll talk about Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr. Now we'll start with Catherine Howard. The date of Catherine's birth is uncertain. Anywhere from 1521 to 1525 have been suggested. As the fifth child of a relatively impoverished younger son of the Duke of Norfolk, she was not important enough for her birth to be noted. Catherine's mother had several children from her first marriage. Catherine was one of 6, so her early childhood was filled with family. Catherine's father, Lord Edmund Howard, was the younger son of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk. Catherine's mother died around 1528, and Lord Edmund had 2 further wives, but no more children. The location of Catherine's early youth is unknown. Possibly Oxenheath in Surrey, which was her mother's childhood home. It was customary for children to be put into the household of friends and relatives of higher rank. Whilst Lord Edmund had no money, he'd have prestigious relatives. Catherine joined the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, at an unknown date in the early 1530s. The Duchess was a firm believer of her other step-granddaughter, Anne Boleyn, and was often in attendance on the Queen. In theory, in her absence, Catherine should have been properly supervised and brought up to be a virtuous young woman, chaste, obedient, and ready to promote her family through a good marriage. But the Duchess did not take her duties towards the young woman in her care with the seriousness that most of her contemporaries displayed. Whilst Catherine learned to read and write, skills that made her much more educated than most women, she and the other young women in the household had much more freedom than a normal gentlewoman. The purpose of Catherine's education was to give her the skills needed to claim a position in the Queen's household prior to marriage. Music was a highly valued skill, so the Duchess arranged for her to have music lessons. Her teacher was Henry Manox, not a professional musician, but the son of a local gentleman connected with the Howards. As far as can be told from sources, the lessons started in 1536, when Catherine was anywhere from 12 to 15 years old. Before long, Manox made sexual advances towards his pupil. Catherine seemed to have rejected his attempts of seduction, but she did meet him privately on several occasions. One of the ladies in the household reprimanded Manox for his attempts to seduce his pupil. Catherine resisted anything beyond kissing and some intimate touching, pointing out to Manox that he was far below her in rank and could never hope to marry her. Other women in the Duchess' position show in their letters that they strictly monitor the welfare of their gentlewoman, whilst the record of investigation into Catherine's life show that the young women were largely unsupervised and had the habit of letting their lovers into the dormitory at night. Even by the 16th century standards, when 12 was the age of consent and 15 or 16 was a fairly usual age for marriage for girls. In Catherine's strata of the society, the Duchess was negligent. It was her role to protect the young women in her care and fit them as wives and mothers in respectable wedlock, not to let them be pawed by servants. In 1537, the Duchess moved her household to Lambeth, and it was there that Catherine met Francis Durham. He was employed by Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and previous had a relationship with Joan Bulmer, one of the gentlewomen in the household. Durham began a sustained attack on Catherine's virtue. Her later testimony suggests that she was very unwilling to enter into a sexual relationship with him, and that initially she might have been raped. Over time, they slept together on numerous occasions. Gifts were being exchanged between them. He gave her fashionable ornaments and she gave him shirt sleeves. They called each other husband and wife. As the law stood, consent, consummation, and the public appearance of being spouses created a valid marriage. But Catherine maintained firmly that she had meant nothing by calling Durham husband, and she had never intended marriage. The relationship took place during autumn and early winter of 1538 and 1539, in which time Durham left England for Ireland and left £100 in Catherine's care, indication that he, at least, thought they were pre-contracted to be married, if not actually married. Manox ousted Durham and sent a letter to the Dowager Duchess and alerted her to what was going on in the household. She investigated, finding Catherine and Durham embracing. In the presence of Joan Bulmer, gave them all a few hearty blows. After Durham's departure, there was talk about a marriage being arranged between Catherine and a distant cousin, Thomas Culpeper, a member of the King's Privy Chamber and a clear favourite of the monarch. This would have been a respectable match for Catherine, and she and Culpeper were introduced and they took to each other. In the autumn of 1539, a new marriage was agreed between Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves. The Duke of Norfolk requested a place in the Queen's household for his three nieces, Marian Norris, Catherine Carey, and Catherine Howard. Since it was unusual for a maid of honor to serve before she reached the age of 16, and perhaps push Catherine's birth date to 1523 or before. The new queen arrived in January, and Catherine took up her duties. It was immediately apparent that Henry was attracted to Catherine, but he was married to Anne of Cleves, and the Duke of Norfolk and his stepmother may well have expected for Catherine to become Henry's mistress. The Dowager Duchess would not have seen any benefit in alerting Henry that her step-granddaughter was not a virgin. It was hardly a demand for being a king's mistress. Henry and Catherine probably slept together sometime after Easter 1540. Henry had a penchant for being married rather than having mistresses, and he married Catherine, perhaps hoping that she was pregnant, on June 28th at Oatlands in Surrey. The king was dotingly in love and fondling his wife in public, singing her praises as his rose without a thorn and showering her with gifts. Catherine, still no more than 19, perhaps as young as 16, had little experience to guide her in the situation she now found herself. Unlike her predecessor, she had very limited knowledge about court life, and the only queen she had seen was Anne of Cleves. Her short tenure and unhappy relationship with Henry had not allowed her to carve out a role as queen. As queen, Catherine was in the position to dispense patronage to friends and family, as other queens had before, as was expected of a society of networking and place hunting, were a part of the social structure. It was not surprising that Catherine, as well as appointing her sisters and half-sisters to her court, also found a place at the request of the Dowager Duchess for Frances Durham. What is surprising is that the Duchess requested it. Perhaps she thought it would be better for Catherine to have earned her erstwhile lover's gratitude. Or perhaps she did not think that the relationship had been more than a few kisses, and that having Durham around would compromise the Queen. Durham was appointed secretary. Whatever Catherine may have felt towards Durham in 1538, by 1540 she had no interest in him whatsoever. But she had become attached to Thomas Culpeper. She sent him a letter, the only known extant letter from her. In it her affection were obvious. My heart dies to know that I cannot be always in your company. Tudor letters were more lavish with compliments and protestation of love than modern communication. But from a queen to a subject, this was strong stuff. The letter has been dated to April 1541 and tells Culpeper to come to her when Lady Rochford is in attendance. It asks him to procure a horse for her servant because she has trouble getting one. This does not seem consistent with Catherine being queen. In late spring 1541, Henry decided to undertake a progress of the north of England. In 1536, the rebels of the Pilgrimage of Grace had been partially bought off, with the promise of a parliament being held at York, along with the coronation for Queen Jane. Neither had occurred, and Henry now decided to visit the rebellious Northerners, and also meet his nephew, James V of Scotland. The royal couple set out in July, travelling to Gainsborough Hall, then Lincoln, before reaching York in September, then returning via Hull and the Moor to Hampton Court. On November 1st, Henry ordered a Thanksgiving service to show appreciation for his wife. Doom was approaching Catherine. The servant of the Dowager Duchess, Mary Lascelles, who had warned Manox about the treatment of Catherine, had told her brother John about Catherine's past. John Lascelles, a committed Protestant, informed Archbishop Cranmer. The explanation given to Lascelles' revelations is that he wanted to strengthen the reforming party at court, rather than the conservative led by Norfolk. But that perhaps put a political perspective born of hindsight onto his actions. He was a devout man who was burnt in 1546 for heresy. He may have been appalled by the thought of a queen who had not been chaste before marriage. Cranmer lost no time sharing the news with Henry. slipping a paper into the king's place at the Chapel Royal. Henry was initially disbelieving, thinking that the accusation were evil slander, with no basis in the truth. He ordered an immediate investigation with the aim of clearing his wife's name. Durham and Manox were sent to the Tower for questioning. Before long, probably under torture, Durham attempted to exculpate himself by asserting that, whilst he had sex with Catherine before her marriage, she had no interest in him afterwards, and was in fact in love with Culpeper. Henry was beside himself with rage and grief. He wanted to take a sword and run her through for the grief she had caused him. He swore that any pain she would suffer would be greater than any pleasure she might have had, and then collapsed into tears. Cranmer was sent to extract a confession out of a nearly hysterical Catherine. He told her that Henry would be merciful towards her, which calmed her down, then pushed her to admitting her relationship with Durham. It seems that he hoped to demonstrate a pre-contract, which would have allowed an annulment of her marriage to Henry. But Catherine either did not understand the implication of the legal situation, or was too honest to lie. She maintained that she never intended to marry Durham. Before long, even the hopes of a reprieve on this situation was removed, as orders came to Cranmer not to mention it again. This was probably once suspicion had fallen on Culpeper. On November 14th, Catherine was taken from Hampton Court to Sion House, a dissolved Brigittine convent. Both Catherine and Culpeper vigorously denied having committed adultery, but they could not deny that they had spent time together in secret, aided and abetted by Catherine's chief lady, Lady Rochford, whose husband, George Boleyn, had been executed for alleged incest with his sister, Queen Anne Boleyn. By act of attainder, Durham and Culpeper were convicted of treason and executed on December 10th, 1541. Durham by the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering, and Culpeper by the axe. Whatever the relationship with Culpeper had been, there was no evidence that Durham had laid a finger on Catherine after she had become queen. On November 22nd, the King's Council demoted Catherine from the rank of queen. 2 days later, she was indicated for treason. An act of attainder was passed by Parliament on January 27, 1542, despite some misgivings amongst the legislators, as there was no proof that Catherine had committed adultery. Henry signed the act into law on February 11th, the day after Catherine had been sent to the Tower. The following Sunday, February 12th, Catherine was informed she would die that Monday. She called for the block to be brought to her so she could practice her last moments, perhaps not wanting to be overcome by fear in public. Next morning, Catherine was beheaded. Her body was interred near that of her cousin Anne Boleyn in St. Peter ad Vincula. Now over to Catherine Parr. Catherine was born in 1512 and was the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr and his wife Maud. The oldest of 3 siblings, she had an education designed to fit her for the role of wife and mistress of a household, probably with some additional of the humanist teaching, fashionable for the daughters of Henry VIII's courtiers. Catherine's father died when she was about 5. The dominant role in her childhood was played by her mother. A strong parental interest was taken in the Parr children by their uncle, Sir William Parr of Horton, and cousin Cuthbert Tunstall, Bishop of Durham. At the age of 16, Catherine was married to Edward Burke, son of Sir Thomas Burke of Gainsborough Hall, Lincolnshire. They lived in the house of her parents-in-law until Sir Thomas Burke gave them a home of their own at Curtin in Lindsey. The couple were of similar age, but nothing is known about their relationship, other than that they did not produce any children until Edward's death in 1533, leaving Catherine a widow at not quite 21 years old. Catherine's widowhood was of short duration. She probably spent a year with relatives at Caesar Castle at Westmoreland before marrying the summer of 1534. Her second husband, John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, was a widower of about 40 years old with 2 children. He had spent most of his life in the north, taking part in Henry VIII's various military jaunts against the Scots, visiting London to attend Parliament from time to time. Although Latimer was nearly 20 years older than Catherine, the couple seemed to have been reasonably happy together. However, Latimer was a man of rather irresolute character, probably conservative in religious outlook, and in no way prepared for the onslaught of the Pilgrimage of Grace. Latimer was one of the nobles who the rebels forced to join the rebellion. He was no favorite of Henry VIII or Cromwell. It seemed likely that he would be punished for his part in the revolt. The Duke of Norfolk spoke up for him, however, and his life was spared. Following this, he was probably happy to move south with Catherine for the last years of his life, dying in early 1543. Her fate sealed, and she married Henry as his 6th wife. As queen, Catherine showed a natural skill of creating setting of elegance and display, both to please her husband and to demonstrate his wealth and power to ambassadors and foreign governments. Henry showed his trust in her by appointing her regent in 1544. Above all, she created a more harmonious atmosphere for her new stepchildren, building close relationships with all of them, despite their disparate temperaments. All was plain sailing. Her increasing dedication to the cause of religious reform made her a target of plots from the Catholic party. She was lucky to escape arrest and potentially burning for heresy through her quick thinking and skills managing Henry. On Henry's death, although not appointed regent, she received a generous bequest and retired to her home in Chelsea, accompanied by her younger stepdaughter Elizabeth. To outward appearance, she began an appropriate period of mourning, and sometime in spring 1547 she married him. The marriage was one of genuine affection, although there were political overtones. Sadly, it was marred by Seymour's scandalous flirtation of the young Elizabeth. Catherine seemed to have overcome this, and, pregnant for the first time, moved to the delightful Sudley Castle to give birth. On August 29, 1548, she gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour. In what seemed a cruel trick of fate, Queen Catherine died a week later from puerperal fever, unable to long enjoy the happiness she surely deserved. Well, that was all for now, and remember to subscribe, and the next video will be out June 15, and it will be about Anne Askew. So, stay tuned.